those higher order brain centers like the respiratory ones, like we'll talk about, as well as ones that modulate your overall brain activity. This is your brainstem kind of generic sort of picture. So more detail here would be, as far as what it's doing, you're going to have cranial nerve nuclei. We haven't talked about the cranial nerve, but we will. We're going to have those basic life function control centers, respiratory, cardiovascular centers, and then all the white matter tracts going up and down to and from the brain and cerebellum and stuff. So this is kind of, we'll go into a couple of details about the particular regions. So the pons and the medulla, right, we're going to kind of lump in together with a couple of special parts on each of them, right? But in general, what we'll find is control of these vital body functions, right? Again, respiratory, cardiovascular, as well as those things like micturition, that is urination, and other very basic kind of functions, right? We'll also have the location of our cranial nerve nuclei, just like we had the spinal cord nuclei in the spinal cord. And then we'll have all the ascending and descending tracts, right, coming up from the spinal cord, going down to the spinal cord, as well as into the brainstem here. So for your medulla, here's a bunch of words I know, but I want to point out a couple of things here. As far as gross anatomy, one of the prominent structures on the front of these are these descending tracts called the pyramids. Over here, cortico-spinal, that means it's coming from the cortex going down to the spinal, right? Descending tracts. And this is the place, right, at the lower end of the medulla is where all those tracts coming from the left side of the body cross over to the right side and vice versa. It's called the decussation of the pyramids, because the pyramids are what those tracts are called. And so those are just the white matter, the myelinated axons going from the cerebrum down to the spinal cord. Then the other parts are these, again, we'll talk about the respiratory, but you have all these other functions here, control centers for vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping, all these kind of reflexes that, you just don't do voluntarily. And then we'll look at the cranial nerves as we get to them. And then the other thing that we want to note is when we talked about the sensory pathway, we saw those relay neurons, right? They came in from your first order sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system. They went up the spinal cord and they synapsed with those second order ones in the brainstem, right? So a lot of those are going to be here. So the nuclei have second order sensory neurons that are going to send that message on to the thalamus, right? And as we'll see, this is a way to modulate the signal, either amplify it or maybe reduce it based on attentional needs. Okay, so partially because of its function in respiratory and heartbeat and stuff, if you have injury to the medulla, if you mess up your respiratory center, you're screwed, right? That can cause death right there. So we'll talk a little bit more about the respiratory in a second. And then the pons is something similar. You got cranial nerve nuclei, you got tracts like these peduncles going to and from the cerebrum and cerebellum. The pyramidal tract from the spinal cord, or to the spinal cord rather, are still going down there. And you also have this so-called pontine nuclei, which are going to be groups of neurons that are passing information from the cerebrum to the cerebellum, right? So it's also going to be a lot of coordination of body movement and stuff like that going on with this pontine nuclei. And then a couple of specific cranial nerves are located over here. But together with the medulla, right, pons also has certain respiratory nuclei. So I'm going to use the respiratory ones as opposed to like your cardiovascular stuff, because it's an interesting example one of the systems that we can voluntarily control, but are normally, on a day to hour, minute to minute basis, second to second basis, are actually being controlled unconsciously, right? So the skeletal muscles, that is going to be your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, are the ones that are going to, when they contract, right, they're going to expand your rib cage. Basically, they're going to expand your thoracic cavity, which is going to increase the volume. When it increases the volume, it's going to decrease the pressure and air is going to flow in there. Something you'll learn all about in Bio 145. But in any case, your diaphragm and your skeletal muscles are skeletal muscles, right? Which means they can be controlled by your cerebrum. Because remember, skeletal muscles are associated with voluntary control. So if I ask you, or if you're in a meditation class and you say, take a deep breath, and you could hold it for however long, and then you can voluntarily pant very heavily or do anything like that. So you can voluntarily control it. On the other hand, this whole time, you weren't doing that, right? You were just breathing automatically without thinking about it, because your brain, you don't want to have to think about breathing all the time, right? So your respiratory centers, particularly the medullary ones, set this rhythmic pace, right, of breathing right there. That is, they cause the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles to, don't worry exactly how, but they cause breathing basically, right? They're causing the contraction and relaxation of them, allowing inspiration and expiration. And that's going to do that unconsciously. There's going to be these rhythmic cells that just sort of do that as a normal basis, right? And they work through this phrenic nerve, right? Which your cerebrum works through, right? So your cerebrum can control the nuclei that for the phrenic nerve, and your medullary ones can control that, right? So you have voluntary and involuntary control over your skeletal muscles controlling your breathing right here. But you can also unconsciously, actually, one more thing about this. So as I said, you don't have to think about breathing, right? So what would happen? There was a disease a while back, sometime in the 1600s. There's some virus going around and it destroyed the respiratory centers. So how do you think these people died? Be brave.
Suffocation.
You would think suffocation, but remember I said you can voluntarily breathe, right? So if these stop working, what would happen? Right? You just have to voluntarily breathe. So what happens when you go to sleep? Well, you couldn't voluntarily breathe, right? You wouldn't be able to control those voluntarily. Like if I said, take a deep breath, right? You're not going to do that in your sleep. So all of a sudden you wouldn't get oxygen. What happens when you're sleeping and all of a sudden you don't get oxygen? You wake up, right? And you wake up and you start breathing heavy, right? Like that. And then you fall back asleep. And then what happens? You don't have oxygen. And then you wake up again and you start breathing. And then you fall asleep. And then you wake up again, you start breathing. You never get any sleep and you die from lack of sleep, basically. So just in case you thought this was a boring function, right? It's a very, obviously very crucial thing to be able to unconsciously breathe, not least of which when you fall asleep. This will still work, when you're in a coma, at least you're in a really bad coma, which affects these areas, then you die, right? In any case, this is adjusting the basic rhythm so you don't have to think about it, right? But sometimes your body figures out that you don't have enough oxygen or you have too much carbon dioxide, and it tells these centers or other centers within here that you have to increase your ventilation, right? And that's what these other respiratory parts are doing. They're going to respond to the particular physiological conditions to adjust the rate of breathing right here, right? So in your brain, we talked about the oxygen sensors in your blood vessels. There's also another just as important, if your CO2 levels get too high, what happens if we think from way back when we talked about this reaction, and this is something that will come up quite a bit in Bio 145, is that high levels of CO2, it's converted, CO2 and water is converted by the enzyme into bicarb ions eventually, which increases the acidity of your blood, right? Which is no good, right? When there's too much CO2. And so your body has a couple ways of dealing with it. One is just to breathe a lot more so you can get rid of the CO2. So when your brain is building up too much CO2 for whatever reason, it's reflected in the cerebrospinal fluid. Your medulla oblongata, brain tissue, has chemoreceptors in there that are going to detect either the hydrogen or the CO2 level, some kind of acidity thing where it's going to pass on that information to your respiratory control centers, right? And then you're going to increase ventilation. Or within your brain, those peripheral chemoreceptors or blood pressure ones in your blood vessels are going to do something similar, right? They're going to stimulate your respiratory control centers to activate those breathing muscles, right? Your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. This is how they interact, right, with these respiratory control centers. So in general, right, high CO2 levels or low oxygen levels are going to stimulate this. That's the stimulus. There's sensory neurons that are going to bring it in. They're going to integrate it within your breathing control centers in the pons and the medulla in a complicated way. I'm not going to get into exactly how they do it, but they do it. The output is to increase your ventilation rate, breathe harder, even without you thinking about it at all, right? So if you were sleeping and your body sensed that there was too much CO2 or not enough oxygen, you might start breathing heavier, right? Without knowing it. That's those breathing centers in your brain. Other ones like your cardiovascular stuff will work on your autonomic nervous system, and they'll do all that totally involuntary on like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle to increase the rate of your heartbeat or something, or relax your blood vessels. All right, so that is your pons and your medulla and one function in a little more detail, that respiratory one. And then the next region, moving up, there's the pons over here. Here is your midbrain, right, which is in between the pons basically, and then the diencephalon over here. And for your midbrain, you want to see, you'll notice that this cerebral aqueduct, that is the passageway from your third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, is going through the midbrain. Okay. And then the other thing you'll notice are all those cerebral peduncles, that is those white matter tracts going from the motor areas in the cerebral cortex to the medulla and pons and everything like that. So you got all these white matter tracts going from the upper brain to your cerebellum. Right? And that's the sort of anatomy of it and the major structures around it. And then the other two things are these two bumps on the back right here, right? This is the anterior side, this is the posterior side, right? Here's the cerebellum. So these two little bumps are on the dorsal midbrain. And that's, sometimes you'll see this referred to as the tectum, the dorsal midbrain, and it contains those four bumps right here. And these, since it's four, sometimes it's called a corpora quadragemina. Quad means four, corpora means body. So these four bodies. And what that means is you have a left and right superior colliculi and a left and right inferior colliculi. And these are visual, the superior and auditory reflex centers that, again, are going to operate independently of your conscious brain. So if you see something out of the corner of your eye, you may not even be conscious of it, but some optic nerve axons are going to come down and go directly to the superior colliculi, even without going through the thalamus. And in that way, your body can react very quickly. Something may be out of the corner of your eye, your head, you have this head jerk reaction, or your eyes move very quickly, right? Without you even thinking about it. So that'd be like a visual reflex. Or if, you're standing there and all of a sudden, like you hear this loud boom, right? Your head turns toward it immediately. That would be your inferior colliculi, right? So loud noise, sound stimuli comes in without passing through your cerebral cortex, goes in your inferior colliculi, and then causes that sort of head turn reaction like that, that startle reflex. Okay, and that's going to be, so visual and auditory reflexes are part of your midbrain thing. And then the other feature I would have you know is that inside of the brainstem that you can't see from the outside, but you have this nuclei called the substantia nigra. Okay, and that substantia nigra here, shown in the brown areas right here, what they are a group of dopamine producing cells. Dopamine producing cells, right? And then what they do with these dopamine producing cells, so they're somewhere up here, or let's just say up here somewhere, right? Substantia nigra. And what they do is project up, their axons go out, basal, and they talk to the basal ganglia and squirt dopamine onto the basal ganglia. And whatever that does in very complicated fashion is involved in the control of movement. Okay, so they're dopamine producing cells over here, and they project up, their axons go out, and they connect with cells of the basal ganglia, which is itself is controlled in like the initiation and control of complex movement patterns. So in Parkinson's disease, well, here's the picture, right? Here's that nuclei, it goes up and projects to the, it has this motor function because it projects to the basal nuclei. There's all sorts of actual, while we're here, there's all sorts of nuclei in the brainstem, or in the midbrain rather, that affect all sorts of brain function right here, right? Pleasure, motivation, right? Compulsion, mood, and everything like that. We're just going to talk a little bit about this one right here, this dopamine producing cells, which go to the basal nuclei. So in Parkinson's disease, what happens is those cells just die off for some reason, right? So all of a sudden you don't have dopamine going into the substantia, into the basal nuclei. And what that shows as, what that presents as, is that for Parkinson's patients, they are kind of frozen a little bit, like they want to do something, in some way. They can't, have trouble initiating movement because of this loss of dopamine. So that is the substantia nigra. Now, the next thing here is I want to recap for your medulla. Over here, I told you that those nuclei for the relay neurons, right, that go from the sensory information, and then before they pass it on to the thalamus, they connect in the medulla. And I said that for both the thalamus and this area right here, this was an area of control, right? An area where we can kind of, the brain rather, and some parts of your brain somehow are going to control the information flow up into your brain from your body right here. So this gets us into this whole reticular formation, which you may have noticed throughout all the brain section slices, there was like parts of the reticular formation. It's not anything that's anatomically distinct, so don't worry about where it is. It's just all in the brainstem. It's a bunch of nuclei and white matter tracts that basically project in a way you don't have to understand, but basically what they're doing is kind of both gating or amplifying information flow to the brain, and that's going to regulate your level of alertness, basically arousal, attention, and if it's very inactive, right, sleep. So this is complex and you don't have to know exactly how it works, but this is the reticular activating system. helping to maintain sort of levels of awareness. So I said last time, if you were sitting there watching this, or you're standing there, right, there was all sorts of information coming into your body that you weren't particularly aware of, right? But you can, if you were focused on anything, you would feel that pressure on the bottom of your foot or on the back of your thigh. Or you could stop for a second and listen to like a car or a dog barking in the background that you didn't notice before, right? Or if you were like scared or something and you were like looking around, you were like suspicious and you like saw some shadows or something, you're really like heightened awareness looking for that, those would kind of like, highlighted in your brain, right? So signals coming from your body, right, from your eyes and ears and all that stuff, all this is part of your reticular formation that's going to either be amplified based on whether you want to pay attention to it or kind of muted out, right? Otherwise, you would have too much sensory information going into your head, right? So filtering the stuff you kind of more need to know based on whatever you happen to be paying attention to. All right, so just here's what you want to know. Arousal, attention, and sleep basically is what this reticular formation in some way is doing, right? But it's kind of like the thalamus where you had the synaptic relay neurons over here that could kind of mute or amplify signals going into your brain right there. All right, so that's a reticular formation all through your brainstem. All right, so that's it for the brainstem, the structure and some of the functions of the brainstem. In the next video, we'll look at those cranial nerves that reside in the brainstem, and their nerves come into and out of the brainstem to innervate the head and neck area. All right, we'll see you next time.